It's a little bit small group, so we can make this really interactive at the end. My name is Hromatko. I'm the VP of Operations for the FinOps Foundation. That's really just a fancy title to say that I'm really passionate about FinOps. I didn't get to see everybody raise their hand earlier. How many people know what FinOps is? Okay, good. I've got some people. So I'll do a little intro of it, and then I'll kind of give some examples throughout this presentation. I've been part of FinOps unofficially for maybe about 7 years, before it was maybe a title out there. I actually came to the AWS Community Day back in 2018, and I think if I would have said FinOps, everyone would have looked at me like, what are you talking about? So it's been really interesting to see the advancements in just the last 4 years. Typically, we've seen FinOps be like a bottom-down approach, or bottom-up approach. So one individual that's like, I've been tasked with doing the bill, I need to know what these reservations are, and to kind of do it as part of their job. That's how it started for me as well. Lately, with all the kind of economic uncertainty, we're actually seeing a lot more top-down pressure on developing a FinOps practice within organizations. And so I'll talk through a little bit about that today. So I work for the FinOps Foundation. We're a not-for-profit organization. If you're familiar with the Linux Foundation, we are a project of that. So I like to say our big brother, big sister is CNCF. They've been there a little bit longer than us, since we've only been with the foundation for about 3 years. What we focus on is building a vibrant community around practitioners. So we have about 10,000 people in our community. This involves the cloud providers. This involves vendors in the community and people that are in enterprises developing FinOps as a practice. We host a bunch of events throughout the year. We do speaking engagements like this. We have a Slack community where we really share a lot of best practices. And then we're mostly funded by our partners and our certification program. A little bit more about our mission. So we're focused on creating connections. So how do we get people that are working in different oil and gas companies doing FinOps talking to each other? They probably have the same problems. How do we get banks connected to each other? We focus on the inspiring career growth. This is actually a field where there are more positions open right now than there are people to fill them. And so we're heavily focused on like, how do we get more people in diverse backgrounds into FinOps? How do we make this a career path? We actually saw this last year, someone officially titled a VP of FinOps at Goldman Sachs. So that's exciting to start to see kind of that hierarchy being developed. And then the other thing we focus on is empowering best practices. So that's anything from developing playbooks, white papers. A big focus of the foundation is called Focus right now. And we're working with all 3 cloud providers on how do we really standardize the billing output and make it a lot more accessible to be trained on how to process it. So that's a little bit about the foundation. Today, I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about the fact that DevOps, SRE, and public cloud really broke IT procurement and traditional IT, and explain why that happened and how do we fix that feeling that it's left. So to back us up a few years ago, we traditionally had platform teams that are like, I need hardware and software. They go to maybe a procurement team to get it. They get finance involved. They create a business case. They get the money that they need to secure that funding. This was a very linear procurement process. If you've been through it before, it was very time consuming to happen, but costs were very predictable. You knew what you needed. You put in a business case. That's exactly what you were going to buy, and resources were known. So it kind of felt like this. It was just an assembly line that took a long time to kind of get through, but high confidence in what we were buying. From the consumption model here, engineers were the requesters at this time. Finance were the approvals, kind of the gate. And then the spend was very, very predictable and static. Like you bought it, you knew you were going to decommission it over 10 years. Very long procurement cycles, and is a very high cost of failure. So if you wanted to develop an application or get a product to market, you are doing a heavy investment to do that. If you have something that is very cyclical, you're having to invest in that hardware all up front and maybe only use it a couple times a year. So the cloud really changed this dynamic, because now we have all these service teams that are able to deploy code whenever they want to get to the money. And so they're really going around procurement and finance. So what that looks like is more of a decentralized model where any engineer can provision that has access. The cost is very variable. At any minute, someone can spin something up that costs $8 to $8,000, and really scalable, almost an infinite scale. So now you have in the finance team and procurement feeling like this is what's happening. So with that being said, engineers now can spend money with code. That sounds really exciting. You hire an intern tomorrow, they can spin something up. Finance is kind of panicky. They have less visibility. the spend is dynamic, but very much less predictable. So when finance organizations are traditionally used to getting like 5-year forecasting, putting a 5-year forecasting on cloud, your percent of being accurate is maybe 20%, right? And so there's some good things happening though. We're able to be more agile, more experimental, should be less waste, right? Because you don't have to procure stuff and have it sit around there. You can just buy what you need to use at that time. But there feels like a lack of communication. There's some tension that's happening between the IT development teams and the finance teams, the procurement. And what you end up seeing is people just being like, we'll just tighten the budget. We'll just give you less money to spend, but you're giving them less money to spend, but they're just spending it anyways, right? So this is where we look at those things that are happening. So decentralized buying power happening. Things are getting very, very expensive. They say 24% year-over-year increase in public cloud. We're also seeing where cloud spend, was maybe traditionally in the 3% of your entire IT budget. I think there's predicting up into 13% to high 20%. Very variable spend, and we're seeing a lot more inefficiency happening. So this is where we need to get these teams together and collaborating. I like to call this the FinOps hug. So sometimes it's just getting these 3 personas in a room and getting them to talk and plan a little bit better together. We need to improve that requester approval relationship. So I'll give you an example. When I worked at previously for Pearson, it's a big, large education company. If you take your AWS certification, you probably took it on a Pearson platform. We wanted to heavily use the marketplace, but we still needed to work with our procurement organization and our software asset management relationship to make sure we had those contracts in place. We had checked all of our legal due diligence. And so we had to figure out a requester and approval relationship that let us use the marketplace, but still follow the processes that we need to fiduciarily and audit-wise be held accountable to. We need more spend visibility. The fact that we can spend in like near real time, we need to see data in near real time as well. We need to be able to predict, or at least get more accurate about our predictions. And we need to speed up the procurement cycle as well. We can't be a bottleneck to engineers to getting work done. And all of this will help lessen the impact of failure. So about 4 years ago, the first time FinOps was used was in a blog actually that AWS wrote, and over time it's really been picking up speed. So really Cloud FinOps is an evolving cloud financial management practice and discipline that is really bringing together engineers and finance to come together and make real-time decisions with real-time data about the data value decisions in real time. So I want to debunk something, because sometimes when people hear the word FinOps, they think, oh, you guys are the cost optimization people. You're the people that are going to tell me to right size and save money. Yes, you're also going to be told to do those things, but we're going to help you make better decisions. We're going to get data in front of you. We're going to take your best practices and help propagate them throughout the rest of the organization as well. Another question I get a lot is like, is FinOps a team? Maybe it could be. When I was at Pearson, I had a team of about 11 people. That was a variety of a data scientist, data analysts, program managers. So I had a fairly big team. Target is one of the biggest teams that I've seen so far. They've got about 20 people. And the reason they have such a huge team is they're actually building their own product. Talking to one of the largest hotel companies around here, and they have one person doing FinOps on their team. So it really depends. You have to build your FinOps practice based on what your organization structure is and what you need. It's also based a lot on spending. So we typically see people that are spending more money, have more dedicated resources. Also complexity. So if you've got multi-cloud, you may need to have specialists across those clouds. I also like to say that it's a team sport, because it's so important that you're working with your cloud provider. I will say, when I was at Pearson, my AWS TAM was like my best friend. We were calling each other the night before Christmas to make huge savings plan purchases together, right? So you have to use them as part of the team, along with finance executives, products, and engineering. Just like any type of practice, it's very common to have some type of framework. So you're all probably very familiar with the well-architected framework. FinOps, we have our own framework as well. I won't go through all the details on this, but we do have a set of core principles that we live by. I always tell everyone that's doing FinOps, print this out, put this in front of you, and make sure you're following these as you're having your conversations. We talk a lot about maturity. And so oftentimes people come in and they're like, I need to be all in these things. And I was like, just start with one thing and do the whole crawl, walk, run to get your stuff to your in a running state. We also talk about a lot about going through phases. So you really need to be sure you're informing engineers, so collecting and getting the data, and then you need to be doing the optimizing. So One of the things that I see sometimes people be is like, I just took all this data from Trusted Advisor and it tells me that you can right size all these instances. Why don't you go do that, right? That's not a productive conversation. So you need to be having those conversations about, I have all this information. Can you help me filter this out and figure out what we need to ignore or what we think we can do? And what are those timelines we can do those in? And what are the other constraints that you might have on your backlog or your development cycle? And then going into the operate, which is to actually action on those recommendations. So I won't go through all of this. We actually do a whole course on this, but I wanted to dig a little bit further into this bottom half here, which is our domains and capabilities. And I think hopefully this will kind of explain to you all what a FinOps team does. So I like to say the green boxes here, this is what FinOps should be answering for the business. So they should be saying to the executives in the business, we are making real-time decision-making. And here are examples of that. We know what our rate optimization should be in RB, and we're tracking that stuff. We are optimizing our cloud usage, and here is that output of that. Here are the teams that are doing really well. Here are some of the worst offenders. Here's why we are not tackling these type of optimizations. The team should be answering where are organizational alignment gaps. One that I faced is a lot with working with our TBM organization right away. We needed to come up with a naming and tagging standard that also aligned to what they had in their naming and tagging standard when they're bringing in revenue data. And so making sure you have those organizational alignments. We're seeing a lot more of that around sustainability for us lately, especially in EMEA space. And other areas that we're seeing some organizational alignment is with ITAM, security. But at the end of the day, the FinOps team is responsible for answering the question of understanding our cloud usage and cost and making sure that's getting allocated out correctly. So I like to tell people that the green up here or what the FinOps practice should be answering for the business. And then all the white things are really the activities that the FinOps enacts through collaboration together. There are 18 of these capabilities. I'm not going to go over them in detail, but I thought I would pick a few that are been showing in our top challenges. So every year we do a state of FinOps survey, about to 1,000 people, and we ask, what's going on in your business and what are you struggling with? And that's at data.finops.org. But I wanted to pull the top challenges. One of the one that's at the top is empowering engineers to take action. This is actually down from last year, which means our FinOps groups and teams have gotten a lot closer to the engineers and being able to make some of those decisions together. We have a long way to go on this. We have some language barriers to work through. We have some getting the data into the engineers to work through. Other areas that's come up as getting to unit economics, which we'll talk about in a minute, getting the organization to adopt FinOps. And then I'll also touch a little bit on governance and policy as well. So throughout the rest of this presentation, I want to pull just 3 of those capabilities and give you some real world experience into it. So let's start with unit economics. So unit economics is really looking at the unit cost and looking at your revenue and trying to figure out where that break-even point is. We used to call this nirvana of FinOps. Like, this would be great if you got to this someday. But we ended up writing a new book on FinOps, the 2nd edition recently, and we switched our tone where we're like, actually, you should be thinking about unit economics from day 1 of building your applications. What I like about unit economics is it's really kind of sometimes difficult for an engineer to be like so focused on the revenue side of things or thinking about the customer side, but unit economics kind of brings that to the forefront. I think unit economics also allows to kind of gamify a little bit a metric. I get that question a lot of like, what's the one efficiency metric? And it's like, well, you could look at CPU, you could look at memory, you could look at reservation coverage. But I think that looking at your unit economic number and trying to challenge yourself to lower that is a better use of time. So I'm going to dive a little bit into this. I did want to show kind of what this looks like to crawl, walk, run. So when you're starting with unit economics, you might be first just figuring out, do I have the data? Do I even have enough data to tell me what's tagged related to what a customer is using? And then you may move into, okay, I've got this data. Can I figure out what the cost per consumption is of this? Then can I figure out what the cost per demand is? And you might have to bring in some like telemetry data to sort that out too, especially if you're using big platforms. And then finally, you want to get to the point where I can say the cost per demand of fully loaded cost. And that's where you're going to need to bring in some of your revenue allocation. This isn't always easy for a lot of large organizations to do because their FinOps team might not have access to this. So I like to tell people too, maybe you're only going to get to the crawl pace where you can only know your unit metric. I lost my notes in front of me. So let me give you a real example just to kind of tie this into. So when I was working at Pearson, we have really big testing platforms that are being used by states. So we have a lot of state contracts. And so we started looking at like, what is the students per month that are using this platform? And these numbers are really small. We're talking, 5, 10, $50 million, 50 million students, depending on which state you're in. So we would see something like this happen every spring. So just like Amazon has their Black Friday, Pearson with elementaries would have this thing happen where in March they have a lot of their students testing. So this is what we would see happening. Nobody's really testing in January, right? Still on holiday. We'd have some school districts start in February, the majority in March, and then start dropping off. But if we start looking at our spend, this is what we're seeing. We're spending quite a bit of money in January and May when we don't have a lot of people testing. Is that our baseline? Is that the lowest that we can go on running this infrastructure? We also see a big spike in February. Well, we're not have that many people testing quite yet. And we still are lingering a lot of costs in April when most of our students are off testing. So by using and looking at this data, we were able to do a couple things. First, we're able to see what's going on in February. Our engineers are doing, we call it the iron triangle. They're making the trade-off that we would rather not end up in the newspaper because 1 million 7-year-olds couldn't test. So we're going to scale up really high, pre-warm, and we're going to be ready for the big testing days. So they were making that trade-off on cost, with not a lot of information on when testing days were happening. The other thing that was happening in April is they were just getting to shutting things off when they could. It was like, we'll get to it later. We don't actually know when they've stopped testing. So we'll think about it in April and go around and ask the product owners if they're done testing. So that's kind of the behavior that was happening. So what we looked at is that was costing $1.18 per student. So that's that unit metric that I was talking about. So just to have one student take this is $1.18. When we started implementing some changes, well, we're going to actually create a dashboard that tells us the completion rate per state and per district. So we can actually start turning off things a little bit quicker. You didn't see some of these numbers drop down, but we're actually going to not pre-warm as big in February because we learned some of these schools don't start testing until the 3rd week of March. So by being able to have this data and have these conversations with the business, the engineering teams felt more empowered to take actions than ever. And then you can see the cost per student went down to $1.10. Now you're thinking that's not a big change, but it's a big change when you're talking millions and millions of students. And so what I'm able to do is the next RFP that comes in for the state of Ohio, I can say, well, based on previous experience, it costs $1.10 per student. You're talking about testing 10 million students. I can give a better estimate of what that's going to cost to run that infrastructure during those months as well. The other thing we allowed us to do is we were able to identify some states, I won't say which one, that was costing $3 per student. Very small state. So that was really concerning. Why is that happening? We learned that there was, in the largest district in that state, some behavior happening by the administrator, the school administrator, that was, they were clearing the cache over the weekend and then causing us to have to download all of the test questions back on a Monday. So the action that they were doing on site was actually driving this up, not something that our engineering was doing. So that was a training opportunity that we could do with the customer to reduce the cost for them. So this is why I like looking at unit metrics. We at Pearson did not ever get to really full unit economics because we still had a gap in connecting revenue back to this, but I'm hopeful that that's where they're getting over time. Next thing I want to talk to you all about is a little bit policy and governance. I like this kind of quote here, which is policy is what we want to happen and governance is how we make it happen. Something I sometimes see in FinOps is people are like, we'll just throw more governance at it and we'll be better at FinOps. It doesn't work when you try to do that with security, and it doesn't always work when you try to do that with FinOps. And so you have to weigh some of these decisions. I've seen people come in and say, we're only going to let them build on this one instance type, or they're going to have to provision instances, but they've got to track all that in ServiceNow. A lot of these trade-off discussions need to be happening with the FinOps teams, the engineering teams, and the business teams of what makes sense. I'm going to dive through an example, a real-world example that was successfully done. So I had gone to my AWS rep and said, hey, I really need to find some easy wins quickly. I got to hire another person. I need to find about $200,000 in savings so I can get that person hired. They said, have you looked at this incomplete multi-upload thing? We kind of noticed that you have a lot of that going on, and I think you guys can clean that up. So we took it through our process of inform, optimize, and operate that I talked about at the beginning. So what I knew is that we had 800 AWS accounts. We had no lifecycle rule on how to configure the S3 buckets around the incomplete multi-part uploads. We were spending about 11K per month, but no more than 1,001 accounts. So it was very distributed that it was happening. So the FinOps team, we wrote up a policy and we submitted it to our cloud governance board. Some might be the Cloud Center of Excellence for you. And we said, we think that we should do this, but we're not just going to go throw it in there and then hope it works, right? We went to this committee that had engineers on it, security, and had the discussion. They're like, yeah, that makes sense. Let's do it. Wrote a cloud custodian policy that went out and took action after 14 days. And we allowed some teams to be able to opt out. Not one of them chose to opt out after about a year. And so this is an example of putting together some governance where you can say, this is what we'd like to happen, and then putting the policy in place. So what we were able to see is this whole time, we kept increasing our multi-part upload in our S3 across all of our accounts. Then we put the policy in place, took a little bit to go into effect. So we're able to say in the month of June, we think there was a 4K potential savings that was done. And then now that's in place going forward, I think we ended up only spending like 97 cents on this. So we could say for the end of the year, we were able to avoid $70,000. These are important concepts to have with your finance team, because I was not allowed to say that I saved $70,000. I avoided it because I made this happen during this time. I was able to count this much of savings. And so those are terms that you're going to want to work out with your finance organization as well. I've definitely seen FinOps organizations go in and say, we've saved all of this money. And they're like, but it wasn't spent. So you didn't really save it yet. So, but that's a real live example. Very productive. It was able to help get me a head count to find more of these things. The last thing I kind of want to touch on before I do some Q&A is education enablement. This is where, again, we've seen with what's going on in the economy, more executives are coming to us and being like, we think we need to have FinOps as a strategy. How do we adopt that? There's probably, if you're working in an organization, there's probably a lot more pressure on to save costs lately than there's been in the past. And so to kind of get started with that, you do need an education enablement program. And so I really recommend defining your training needs. AWS has an AWS Skills Guild that kind of goes through this and helps you kind of pinpoint where you need some training. And then you can help, facilitate that. You can actually look at building and benchmarking as well. We have an open source tool called assessment.finops.org, where you actually go through an assessment with like your core teams and then your business unit teams and figure out what areas they need to improve. I ran this with JP Morgan not too long ago, and one of the areas that they needed to hone in on was their forecasting, and the engineers weren't even sure how they were supposed to provide that forecasting data. And so this was something that helped improve their cadence calls with them. Also look for some training, both informal and formal training. So the foundation offers training. At Pearson, we were the first organization to do what AWS calls as FinHacks. So they can come in for 3 hours and kind of show you how to gamify and get some people in a room to start shutting some things off. We did it when we were trying to really train our engineers on how to have more confidence in moving to Spot as well. And the last area to look at is like really leverage your cloud provider. So many of you probably have EAs. They can come in and teach and educate your teams on things. There's some really good use cases out there as it relates to all these capabilities to dive into. And then just wanted to leave you all with some additional resources. So I subscribe to the Cloud Financial Management blog. You're always hearing about different price decreases and instances, new functionality that's coming out. If you haven't checked out this open source kudos dashboard, you can go out there and deploy this. Oh, I'm forgetting the term of it now, but you can go out there, deploy this, and it's basically a live dashboard that shows you all of your cloud spend and you can drill into it. There is Keys to Optimization. It's a Twitch done by Stephanie Gooch, where she goes on about once a week and kind of interviews various people on what they're doing in their space to optimize. The foundation at finops.org, you can join that. Again, we're open source. We're always putting out white books and playbooks. And then we have a FinOps podcast as well, where we go a little bit deeper into stories with our different end users. All right, I know that was a lot of information. I just want to leave you with this, that if you don't have a FinOps practice, you probably should consider it, whether it's one employee or a few employees doing it. while FinOps may have been a buzzword back in 2018, it is a real thing that is here to stay. 9 out of the 10 Fortune 500 companies are doing FinOps, 44 of the 50 are. About 80% are globally. We're seeing a lot of uptick, and APAC recently starting to adopt this as well. So I'll leave you there and see if you all want to ask any questions. One back there. Yeah, so I previously worked for Pearson, which was a large education company. I actually now work for the FinOps Foundation. Yep. So I work for them now. And so there's a lot of training. There's an edX course that's completely free to take. And then there's like certification if you're looking to get more of like a badge-based training. We actually just launched a pro course, which is really equivalent to about a college level course. It's about 50 hours of content that you have to go through. Yeah, good question. So there's a couple different ways. So we have end users that will attend from some of these companies, and they're really either helping contribute to best practices or they're there to learn about best practices as well. So they're typically coming to our events or they're submitting use cases to us. I also run something called an enterprise program. So I'm working with some of these large companies and going in and assessing them and kind of coaching them through what they're working through. A lot of it is when you have one person doing it and like, how do you get it to expand to the entire organization? And so we will come in and, you know, pitch it to your executive, explain it to your executive if people need help with that too. You can talk to me after this. Yeah, the assessment is free. It's open source. So it's just assessment.finops.org and you can go and take it. And then, yeah, staff can do some guided assessments as well. I'll leave you with a couple extra slides I have here, which is, whoops. I get this question a lot too, like what type of FinOps tools are you using? So when we did the State of FinOps survey, we found that most people are using 4.1 tools to do FinOps. And so that might look something like this. So native tools using AWS budgets, Azure cost management. They're also using some type of platform tool. When I was at Pearson, we built a data lake to basically process all of the data through from all the cloud providers. Then starting to see a lot more people pulling in observability data from Datadog or New Relic, right? Trying to get that memory and CPU. And then there's a lot of specialty tools. I saw Spot.io is out there as a partner. They're one of our partners too, and they're out there. So a lot more in the specialty space is coming up. KubeCost is another one really focused on Kubernetes optimization. And if I haven't sold you on it yet, there is a demand for more FinOps practitioners. And so part of the State of FinOps is we talk about what the size of teams look like. So most organizations that are spending about $8 million annually have a dedicated team of 8. Spending under 10 million, you may have a dedicated 2. The most common things I hear from people is I'm doing 2 jobs, but I would like to do FinOps full time. And the last one, if it's still there, maybe I don't have it there. Oh, I didn't pull it in. I had a salary slide that I was going to show. The average mean in the US is about 140. So, you know, it's a pretty lucrative field to get into. And I think what's nice about it is you can take a lot of people from diverse backgrounds and train them up, right? You can be trained on cloud. You can be trained on how to, you know, be analytical. You can, so I actually took someone that was like a 3rd grade teacher and was able to get them to come into FinOps within 3 years and be trained up. The other thing that's really cool about it is like one day you can be talking with an engineer, the next day you're reporting to a CTO. So there's like that very variety of level of interactions that you're having with organizations too. Cool. Well, I'll take any more, maybe take one more question if anybody has one. That's a good question. It depends on your complexity and your size. It's pretty amazing what we see some people do in 1 year. They'll join the foundation and they'll be like, I need to fix my chargeback. And we're like, okay, well, here's some playbooks on tagging, get started on tagging. And then they'll like disappear and come back. And all of a sudden they'll be like, yeah, I've fully allocated all my cost out. And we now have a forecast in place within a year, which is pretty impressive. We've got people that have been in this space for probably 5, 6, 8 years. And they come and go, and they've been coming back and being like, okay, now I'm stuck on the sustainability problem. How do we get through that? So there's always another challenge on the horizon. The AI machine learning stuff, like how can FinOps use more of that for like anomaly detection, forecasting? But on the other hand, how do we get the organizations ready to adopt it? There's a really good story. I'm trying to think if I can say the company name, where their executive said one day, we're having a whole week where I want everyone to do machine learning and AI. I want you all to take the week and I want you to just explore. Well, they didn't account for what it was going to cost in the cloud ascent. So it was over $100,000 that spun up. It was all in one platform. So that one platform team was like, we didn't have budget for this. Like, who's paying for this? And so that was something the FinOps team had to figure out of like, okay, let's figure out who was logged into these systems. Let's charge that out to it. Or is it just going to be centrally billed because it was initiated by the CEO? So we're watching a lot of that stuff, what's happening and what it's going to end up costing. And how do we forecast that a little bit better too? Yep, it's free to join the foundation. The way that we are sponsored is by the different partners, and then our certification program too. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks. I'll be here throughout the rest of the day, and I think there's a couple other FinOps topics, which makes me super excited. So happy to talk to anybody.